The silence that speaks louder than thunder. What if the silence you're experiencing right now isn't God's absence, but His invitation? Yes, I'm talking to you, the one who has prayed, cried, fasted, and received no answer. The one who feels like heaven has gone quiet. But what if I told you that the silence is holy? What if I told you that Moses, the great prophet of fire and thunder, met God not in the noise, but in the stillness? This is not just another video. This is your moment of encounter. Because there is a psalm hidden in the scriptures, a psalm written in the harsh silence of the wilderness, where Moses heard God's voice clearer than ever before. And this psalm wasn't sung by a choir or whispered in a temple. It was born in the desert when all else had failed. You're about to discover the oldest psalm in the entire Bible, written by the very man who stood face to face with God. And in this psalm, there's a spiritual key that can unlock the silence over your life. Not tomorrow, not next week, now. But I must warn you, this message is not for the faint of heart. Because once you hear what Moses heard, this isn't just about hearing God's voice. It's about becoming the kind of person God speaks to. So if you're ready to stop filling the silence with your fear and finally listen, Moses is going to teach you how. Let's begin. The wilderness is not punishment. It's preparation for the voice. The wilderness, it's dry, isolated, quiet, unforgiving. And yet, it is sacred. Most people think that being in a wilderness season means something went wrong, that God is angry, distant, or punishing them. But Moses teaches us something radical. The desert is where God prepares you to hear what you cannot hear in the noise of Egypt. Before Moses ever parted the Red Sea or stood on Mount Sinai, he spent 40 years in the silence of Midian. No miracles, no burning bush, just sheep, sand, and stillness. Why? Because it's in the wilderness that God trains the soul to stop reacting and start listening. Psalm 90, the psalm Moses wrote, doesn't begin with praise or requests. It begins with perspective. Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. Moses wasn't praising the place. He was praising the presence. Even in the wilderness, even in the silence, God remained a home for his soul. The silence of the desert does something the noise of Egypt never could. It reveals the false voices you've been obeying. The voice of fear, the voice of ambition, the voice of guilt, the voice of Pharaoh. God strips them away, one by one, until only his voice remains. Maybe that's why you feel lost. Maybe you're not being punished. You're being invited, not into more effort, but into more awareness. Because when Moses learned to survive without applause, without affirmation, without answers, he finally heard the whisper of God. The question is not, why is God silent? The question is, what is he removing from my ears so I can hear him? Your wilderness isn't empty. It's echoing with the footsteps of a God who speaks softly but moves mountains. The desert is where false identities die. Moses wasn't always a prophet. He wasn't always a leader. He wasn't even always a Hebrew, not in his own mind. He was raised as an Egyptian prince in Pharaoh's palace, surrounded by luxury, trained in authority, dressed in royalty. But none of it was who he truly was. And so God led him to the desert to strip him of the costume. When God wants to use you, he doesn't just anoint your strengths. He begins by confronting your illusions. Moses had to lose everything Egypt gave him, the status, the pride, the entitlement, so he could remember who he really was, a servant of the Most High. Psalm 90 doesn't talk about fame, titles, or success. It speaks of frailty. You turn people back to dust, saying, "Return to dust, you mortals." This isn't shame, it's clarity. Moses learned the secret to hearing God's voice: humility. The world tells you to build a name, but the desert teaches you to kneel. Because it's only when the identity others gave you has died that God can speak to the one he created. Maybe you've been fighting to hold on to something that God is trying to remove. A label, a role, a mask. But every day in the silence is a scalpel in God's hands, cutting away what is false to awaken what is eternal inside you. Moses lost his royal garments, but he gained something better, a heart that could carry the weight of God's voice. So if you're feeling stripped, unseen, forgotten, maybe it's because you're standing where Moses once stood, not in exile, but in the beginning of a calling, the power of silence, where God speaks without words. In a world addicted to noise, silence is terrifying. We turn on the TV to avoid it, scroll endlessly just to drown it. But in the desert, silence is not the absence of God. It is the presence of his process. Moses didn't hear God in Pharaoh's palace, where the voices of power and politics were loud. He heard God in the stillness of the wilderness, surrounded by sheep and solitude. Why? Because God speaks clearest when all the other voices have been silenced. Psalm 90 teaches us something profound about this kind of silence. It doesn't fill it with human explanations or spiritual cliches. Instead, Moses prays, "Teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom." That is the kind of voice you only hear when you're still enough to count your days, still enough to feel the fragility of life, still enough to stop pretending you're in control. Silence isn't punishment, it's preparation. It's where God rewires your thinking and reorders your desires. It's where the lies lose their power because the echo chamber of self is interrupted by the whisper of the Spirit. Moses didn't fill the silence with his own words. He listened, and that listening turned a fugitive into a prophet. Because it's in the silence that you learn. God doesn't need a crowd to call you. He only needs your attention. If you've been stuck in a season of silence, don't despise it. You're not forgotten. You're being retuned to hear not just what he wants to say, but what you couldn't have heard with all the noise around you. Your silence isn't empty, it's full of God. When time feels wasted, but God is working. Moses spent 40 years in Egypt and another 40 in the wilderness. That's 80 years of waiting before he stepped into the fullness of his calling. To the human eye, it looked like a wasted life, from prince to shepherd, from potential to obscurity. But in heaven's timeline, it was perfect preparation. Psalm 94 says, "1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by." This isn't poetic exaggeration. It's God pulling back the curtain to remind you he doesn't waste time, he redeems it. In your eyes, that detour was delay, but in God's hands, it was development. What looked like you being stuck was actually God letting your roots go deep so your future could rise strong. We often beg God for acceleration, but we ignore his greatest gift, refinement. Refinement takes time. It humbles you, teaches you, strips away what can't go into the next season, and molds you into someone who can carry what he's about to entrust to you. Think about this. If Moses had gone straight from Pharaoh's palace to leading Israel, would he have had the patience, the humility, the brokenness to intercede for a rebellious people? Would he have learned how to stand between God's wrath and their sin? No. He learned that in the so-called wasted years. He learned that in silence, in waiting, in wilderness. So if you're in a season where nothing seems to be moving, where doors are shut, people have walked away, and heaven feels quiet, don't curse the clock. Consecrate the moment. Because what feels like a pause is often where God is doing his most important work, not around you, but in you. God's delay isn't denial, it's divine alignment. He's setting the stage, not just for what you'll do, but for who you must become to handle it. How the desert strips you of illusions and restores your identity. In Egypt, Moses was defined by power, privilege, and position. He was the prince, educated, trained, respected. But in the desert, he was no longer somebody. He was just a man, alone with sheep, silence, and his thoughts. And that was the point. Sometimes God allows the wilderness not to punish you, but to purge you, to tear away the layers of identity that the world built around you. Titles, achievements, relationships, expectations, so you can finally meet who you are in Him. Psalm 93 says, "You turn people back to dust, saying, 'Return to dust, you mortals.'" It sounds harsh, but it's deeply freeing. God is saying, come back to the beginning, strip it all down. Let me rebuild you from the dust. Because what He's building in you can't stand on pride, applause, or external validation. It must be rooted in truth, and truth is often found in silence. That's what the desert does. It silences the noise of ego and comparison. It makes you confront what's left when there's nothing left to prove. And that's where God meets you. That's where Moses discovered he wasn't the prince of Egypt. He was the servant of the Most High. That's where you'll discover you're not the sum of your failures or the echo of your critics. You're not your trauma. You're not your past. You are who God says you are. And you hear that best when everything else is stripped away. So don't resist the silence. Let it sanctify you. Don't fear the emptiness. Let it reveal what can never be taken from you. The world told you who to become. But the desert is where God shows you who you truly are. The burning bush appears when you finally stop running. The burning bush did not appear when Moses was in Pharaoh's palace. It did not appear when he was planning his next step or fighting for justice his own way. It appeared when he had nothing left to prove, when he was still, broken, and surrendered. Exodus 3:2 says, "There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush." Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. That was no ordinary moment. It was heaven interrupting earth, not in a crowd, not on a stage, but in the hidden silence of the desert. God often waits until we stop striving to speak clearly. He doesn't shout over the noise. He waits until the heart is quiet enough to hear the whisper. And that whisper becomes flame, a fire that doesn't consume you, it calls you. Psalm 90:16 echoes this divine encounter. "May your deeds be shown to your servants, your splendor to their children." God's glory is revealed not when you're at your strongest, but when you're still enough to notice the miraculous in the mundane. You may be wondering now, wondering why you haven't heard anything yet, why the silence is so heavy, why the answers haven't come. But maybe God is just waiting for you to stop, to kneel, to listen. Moses didn't chase the fire came to him. And when it did, it changed the trajectory of his life forever. You don't need to create the moment. You only need to be ready when it comes. So ask yourself, have you stopped long enough for the fire to find you? Because when you do, God will speak. And when He does, you will never be the same. God is in the silence, because that's where faith grows. Silence is uncomfortable because it exposes the noise we've been using to hide. We live in a world that equates stillness with weakness, quietness with failure. But in the kingdom of God, silence is often the soil where faith grows strongest. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness, not hearing God speak, not seeing signs, just tending sheep. To the world, it looked like a wasted life. To God, it was preparation. Psalm 94 says, "1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the night." That means what feels like delay to you is not delay to God. The silence is not punishment, it's process. It's where your dependency is born. It's where your idols die. It's where your ears finally begin to hear what couldn't be heard in the noise. Moses had to learn that it wasn't about his timing, his strength, or his plans. He had to let go of everything he thought he was, to become everything God had called him to be. And the same is true for you. Faith is not built in the fire. Faith is built when the flame has faded and all you hear is the wind. It's built when heaven seems silent, but you still believe. When you keep walking, even when the path disappears, what if your silence is the very confirmation that God is near? Because He knows that you're finally ready, not for answers, but for trust, not for comfort, but for calling. If you've been waiting in silence, don't rush it. Don't curse it, embrace it, because this is where the real work is happening, beneath the surface, in the silence, in your soul. And when God does speak, you'll know, because your faith will be ready to respond. When God calls your name, the silence breaks with purpose. After decades of silence, one word changed everything. Moses. In Exodus 3:4, the Lord called out from the burning bush, "Moses, Moses." And the response was simple but loaded with meaning, "Here I am." Do you see it? God didn't give a speech, didn't offer comfort first, didn't explain the plan. He called the name. Because when God finally speaks after a long silence, He doesn't start with answers, He starts with identity. The wilderness wasn't about God forgetting Moses. It was about Moses forgetting himself, who he thought he was in Egypt, who he tried to be by force, who he failed to become. But now, after years of silence, God calls not the prince, not the fugitive, but the servant, the one who's been emptied enough to hear, the one humble enough to say, "Here I am," even before knowing what comes next. Psalm 90 teaches us to number our days, to understand that our time is not our own, that we are but dust, yet known by name by the eternal God. So when God breaks the silence, He doesn't need to explain everything. He simply calls your name, and if you've been trained by silence, your soul will recognize the voice. Maybe today God is calling yours, not with thunder, not with lightning, but with a whisper that echoes in your heart. Daughter, son, are you listening now? The silence was your training ground. The calling is your next step. And if you can say, "Here I am," He will do what only He can do. Because when God calls, He already sees the path, and His voice doesn't just break silence, it builds destiny. The fire doesn't burn you, it awakens you. The bush was on fire, but it wasn't consumed. That was the sign. Not that God had fire, but that His fire refined without destroying. Moses had seen many fires before. He had seen the fire of Egyptian wrath, the fire of his own impulsive justice, the fire of guilt burning in his conscience for killing a man and running. But this was different. This fire did not devour. It called. Psalm 90, written by Moses, says, "Satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love." That's not the request of a man untouched by fire, but of one who's been through it and came out awakened. This is the paradox of God's presence. It sets you on fire, but not to destroy you, to wake you up. Sometimes the silence you're in is not because God is absent, but because He's preparing the fire that will speak without consuming you. Moses didn't run from the bush. He turned aside to look. That's the moment everything changed. Will you turn aside, or will you keep walking past what looks strange, inconvenient, or even too painful? Because sometimes God shows up in the middle of what looks like it should destroy you. But instead, it awakens your spirit. And this fire is not a punishment, it's a call. It doesn't burn your body. It burns away your fear. It consumes your shame. It melts your doubt. It clears the fog. Until what remains is someone finally ready to listen. The silence was for your stillness. The fire is for your calling. And just like Moses, you'll discover that what was meant to end you becomes the very flame that ignites your mission. From the silence to the mission, what Psalm 90 leaves you with: Moses entered the silence broken, ashamed, and uncertain. He left with a mission. Psalm 90 is not just a reflection on the brevity of life. It's a roadmap from brokenness to purpose. It begins with, "Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations," and ends with, "Establish the work of our hands for us." Yes, establish the work of our hands. Do you see the journey? It starts with finding home in God. Not in Egypt, not in status, not in the opinions of others, but in God alone. And it ends with a plea. Let my life matter. Let what I do not be in vain. Let the desert not be wasted. Let my pain not be pointless. This is the cry of the healed. The psalm Moses wrote wasn't about escaping the desert. It was about hearing God in it, being shaped by it, and discovering that even the silence had purpose. And when you finally hear God in the silence, you no longer crave noise to feel alive. You crave presence, you crave depth, you crave mission. The silence taught Moses that God is not always in the thunder, but in the stillness, not always in the spectacle, but in the whisper. And now, it's your turn. If you're in a season of silence, Psalm 90 is not just a comfort, it's a calling. God doesn't waste pain. He forges prophets in it. He births leaders from it. He calls deliverers through it. You were not forgotten in the silence. You were being formed. Now, just like Moses stepped forward, the same fire that called him is calling you now. And like him, you'll discover what you thought was the end was only the beginning.